This video is brought to you by Incogni. With the European headlines currently dominated by reports of the rise of the Eurosceptic right, you might assume that the EU was facing a democratic crisis. However, according to the latest Eurobarometer data, support for the EU has held relatively steady for the past few years or so. And today, far more Europeans have a positive view of the EU than a negative one. After the number of Europeans holding a positive view of the EU fell to less than a third during the Eurozone crisis, the EU's reputation recovered in the late 2010s, and by 2020, less than 20% had a negative image of the EU, with 45% holding a positive view. It's hovered around this level ever since, with the remaining 35% or so holding a neutral image of the EU. Nonetheless, there are some pretty stark disparities between countries, with countries in the north and west being generally more pro-EU than countries in the south and east. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the most and least Eurosceptic countries in the EU, and try to figure out why these countries feel the way that they do. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, before we get into it, we should say that by Eurosceptic, we don't just mean in favour of leaving the EU or holding a negative image of the EU. Rather, we're going to be using a slightly wider definition of Euroscepticism, looking at three key indicators provided in the latest Eurobarometer survey: level of trust, optimism, and perception of the EU. Obviously, because we're not using a simple, straightforward metric, there's space for debate. So if you think there's a country that we should include instead, let us know in the comments. Anyway, caveats out the way, let's start by looking at the most Eurosceptic countries, i.e. those countries that trust the EU the least, have the most negative views, and are most pessimistic about the EU's future. First up, we have Czechia. The data suggests that Czechs have the most negative view of the EU, with 33% of respondents stating the EU conjures up a negative image. This is more than 31% of Czechs who have a positive image of the EU, and makes Czechia the only member state to have a net negative view of the EU. According to the Eurobarometer, the main reason why Czechs think that they haven't benefited from being an EU member is that issues that are important to them are best dealt with at the national level. For instance, Czechia has been sceptical of certain EU integration projects, most evident in the Euro debate. Despite being part of the EU for 2 decades, Czechs are staunchly opposed to accepting the euro as an official currency, with 63% opposing the idea. President Václav Klaus, who served from 2003 to 2013, also refused to sign the Lisbon Treaty, which aimed to streamline EU decision-making processes. The treaty was criticised for centralising power and reducing national sovereignty, but under pressure from other EU leaders, Klaus signed it in the end. Today, the current Czech government is very unpopular, and it has a very strong Eurosceptic bloc that outpolls the more moderate and pro-EU government parties. This bloc notably includes ANO, currently at 34%, and the Freedom and Direct Democracy Party, or SPD. Next on the list are Cyprus and Greece, who, as well as having the second and third lowest opinion of the EU, also have some of the lowest trust rates in the EU. The latest Eurobarometer data shows that 61% of Cypriots and 58% of Greeks tend to distrust the EU. So why is this? Well, the data suggests that it's a lot to do with democracy, with Greeks and Cypriots generally dissatisfied with how democracy is working in both the EU and their national governments. Greeks and Cypriots are also more likely to say that they don't think that their voices count in politics, with 71% of Greeks and 75% of Cypriots expressing this view. Broadly speaking, Eurosceptic sentiment in both countries seems to have been fueled by the EU's behaviour during the Eurozone crisis. Many Greeks feel that the EU forced Greece into a painful and futile austerity programme to get its bailout loan. Similarly, many Cypriots felt that the EU, and especially Germany, behaved unfairly in forcing Cyprus through a similar ordeal and undermining its financial services industry in order to access bailout funds. The effect of these austerity programmes are still felt today. Over 1/3 of Greeks and 1/5 of Cypriots have difficulties paying their bills most of the time, some of the highest levels of all member states. Our last country, which you've probably guessed if you've been paying attention to the data, is France. While the French have a slightly more positive opinion of the EU than the other countries we've mentioned so far, the EU's second biggest economy is actually the most pessimistic and the least trusting about the EU. The French are also least satisfied with how democracy works in the EU, and at least a quarter of French people are apparently planning to vote in the upcoming EU elections, with the sole purpose of expressing their discontent. Now, this is in part a reflection of the generally antagonistic relationship the French have with the state. But it's also because France has what might be described as a unitarian political culture, which is at times at odds with the European culture of compromise. France is also having a tough time economically at the moment, with unemployment climbing to 7.4% at the end of 2023, and Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire warning of an austerity budget in 2024. Many French people apparently blame this on the EU, with 22% of French people saying the EU puts their jobs in danger, and 25% saying membership reduces living standards, the highest in the EU. So those are the most Eurosceptic countries. Now let's move on to the least Eurosceptic ones. Let's start with the country that believes it had benefited most from EU membership, Lithuania. Lithuanians are among the staunchest EU backers. So why is this? Well, like Czechia, Lithuania is a former communist country, but Lithuania's economy was much weaker and essentially agrarian before joining the EU. This meant it received significant funding and support through various EU programs like the cohesion policy, which aims to reduce socio-economic disparities among member states. Since joining the EU in 2004, Lithuania's GDP per capita has quadrupled, from about $6,000 to $22,000. For the small country bordering Russia, the EU also offers protection to Lithuania from any security risk. The Eurobarometer data reveals this is really important for Lithuanians, and 41% feel defence and security should be one of the EU's priorities. Another small country that benefits a lot from the EU is Luxembourg. Luxembourg has the highest majority of respondents, around 90%, saying membership of the EU is extremely important and a good thing. One of the 6 founding members of the EU, Luxembourg has a long history with the EU, despite a few hiccups over tax scandals. They host several EU institutions, which creates a sense of engagement and identification with the EU, and a lot of their political power derives from their outsized role in the EU. Luxembourg has also developed an internationally recognised financial sector, partly due to its attractive legal and business environment within the EU. Many multinational companies and financial institutions have chosen Luxembourg as their European headquarters, in part because Luxembourg has helped these companies save billions in tax payments, as revealed by the 2014 LuxLeaks scandal. Nonetheless, its role as the centre of European finance has made Luxembourg one of the wealthiest countries in the world, with a GDP per capita of around $133,000. Our next country is Ireland. As well as having an overwhelmingly positive image of the EU, Irish citizens are the most satisfied with how democracy works in the EU, and the most optimistic in regards to the future of the EU, and are the staunchest believers that things in the EU are going in the right direction. Why? Well, the Irish ambassador put it this way. Ireland was a poor agricultural economy before joining the EU in 1973, and membership has facilitated Ireland's rapid economic growth. Relations between Ireland and the EU also improved significantly over Brexit, when the rest of the EU backed Ireland in its various disputes with the UK. In the first days of negotiations, EU negotiator Michel Barnier gave a speech reassuring Ireland that, quote, Ireland's interest will be the Union's interest, and that Ireland would enjoy the support of a united EU. So that concludes our list of the most pro- and anti-EU countries. Honourable mentions for the anti-EU category go to Austria and the pro-EU category Denmark. Let us know what you think and if you think that there are any that we've missed. Now, while you've been learning about which countries are the most pro and anti-EU, you might not realise that shady forces are working in the background to collect personal data from various sites and bundle it together, ready to sell it to a third party. Now, these data brokers can sell this bundle of information about you to anyone from a company to an online criminal. Now, while you might assume that you're safe online, perhaps you change your password regularly, or perhaps you're a hawk and always uncheck that little box that signs you up to annoying newsletters. Unfortunately, this doesn't completely save you. Companies that hold your data can still fall victim to a data breach, meaning that these data brokers can still compile information about you to sell on to others. Now, this is where our sponsor, Incogni, comes in. They reach out to these data brokers on your behalf, request that your data is removed, and deal with any problems that might arrive. In fact, they're tenacious and will put in multiple data removal requests even after your data's been removed to make sure that it doesn't go back on the market. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, by using our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks for Incogni for sponsoring this video.